Welcome. I'm Debbie Rosas, and you are listening to Get In. And today I have a special guest, Loretta Ross. We're not going to just get in, but we're going to talk about calling in. I'm the founder of the NIA Technique, a movement art practice. It's all about body and life. It's been changing lives since 1983 when I took off my shoes and said, you know what? There's got to be a better way to treat the body and listen to the body. Now, Loretta Ross is somebody that I can't tell you I admire so much, not just because of the path that she has walked, but the wisdom that she is willing to share, that she's taken her lived experiences and created something, giving back to all of us that we can benefit from this wisdom. And I can't wait. It's about something that I think is really crucial to human survival. It's about turning our differences into strengths versus liabilities. And, it's all about understanding that we can have shared values. I certainly have people in my family like that, but we can disagree. So calling in, it's not just a book. It's a philosophy. It's a way. It's tools, healthy transformational tools to help us deal with, I don't know about you, but in the world today, I feel it, whether it's through social media or, as I said, somebody in my family or a friend, confrontation. So, having a method and having a process that allows us to engage in what? Constructive, not destructive conflict. Having conversation, calling out. So, take a deep breath with me and just get comfortable. Relax your lower jaw, soften your heart a little bit, and sit tight as I tell you about my guest. She is called the calling out and the calling in queen. You gotta love a queen, Loretta Ross. She she gleefully called out strangers, and get this, even once she called out President Barack Obama. You gotta love that. For over 5 decades, since the 70s. In the 70s, let's see, I was home with 2 little babies. She's been an activist, a voice. She is a professor, a public intellectual whose desire is to enact change. Not just enact change, but build movements. And if you're in the NIA community, you know it's all about movement. That's how things happen. But movement around something she calls calling in. Now, everything she shares, as I mentioned earlier, is rooted in personal experience. She's walks her talk, she's been on the path. It's rooted in education and a philosophy, a calling in approach, tools, techniques, principles that get results in this world today, which is confrontive and very messy. She calls it, and I agree with her 100%, a cultural monster, what we're living. She is a pioneering Black feminist and MacArthur Genius Fellow. And her message, boy, I feel it so much in every cell of my body. It's urgent. Her book is exhilarating, calling in how to start making change with those you would rather cancel. I can think of a few people right now that this has really been helpful. It is a memoir, a manifesto, and a handbook. How to rein in the excesses of cancel culture. Let's hope. So that we can truly communicate and solve problems, here's the word, together, right? What's so unique to me about calling in is the constructive, not destructive approach for having conversation and changing behaviors together. Now, reading it at times, personally, I couldn't stop myself from crying. There's a quote I'm going to read to you. It's on page 56 in the book. We can tear that person or group to shreds in a way that affirms our values. We create memes reducing someone to the laughing stock of the internet that day. We write think pieces on how we are not like that person and obviously wouldn't make the same mistakes they've made. We deconstruct them as thinkers, activists, groups, bodies, partners, parents, children, finding all the contradictions and limitations and shining bright light on them. When we are satisfied that the person or the group is destroyed, we move on. Or sometimes we just move on because the next scandals arrive, the smell of fresh meat overwhelming our interest in finishing the takedown. It's addictive, isn't it? I really thought about that, and I thought about myself, and I thought about how many times I felt the urge to lash out, to blame somebody. But then I remember, wait a minute, I'm trained to take responsibility for what I'm feeling, for what I'm thinking. I believe this book to be one of the most important and timely reads, a relevant book of our time. It has helped me navigate something I never ever thought I would have to deal with in my business. It's a health, fitness, well being company. I never imagined that through human dynamics and social media, particularly, I would have to deal with anger and blame and shame and cancel. Today's world, what was going on was a big wake up call, and this book helped me to not only wake up, but to calm down. And if you're like me, you're going to read these words and you're going to feel just deep gratitude for somebody doing the work that I don't want to do. And maybe you don't want to do. Loretta, I welcome you from the bottom of my heart, top of my heart, back of my heart, from my whole being. Welcome and thank you for being willing to share your wisdom with me and with my audience.
Thanks for having me on your show.
Awesome. So, your story is so deeply moving. Can you take us back and tell everybody that pivotal moment? It's a fantastic story. When you received a letter from an incarcerated man asking for help not to be a rapist anymore. And if there's anything else you want to begin your story with, please go for it.
When I was 25, I was director of the DC Rape Crisis Center, which was the first rape crisis center in the country. I was a rape and incest survivor, and that's what drew me to that work. While I was there, early in my tenure, I got a letter from a man named William Fuller, who had been convicted of raping and murdering a woman, and he was incarcerated at Lorton Reformatory. His letter basically said, outside, I raped women. Inside, I rape men. I'd like not to be a rapist anymore. And can you help? I have to honestly say, when I first got that letter, it triggered all of my trauma. But mostly it triggered anger because I was like, how dare you expect us to help a perpetrator when we don't even have enough resources to help the victim?
Yeah.
So I buried the letter under my paperwork on my desk for months. But tellingly, I never threw it away. And finally, I had to scratch the itch. What is this guy talking about? And so I made a plan to go down to Lorton to talk to him. And I think I actually went down there to call him out, to tell him off,
Yeah.
because I wasn't able to ever hold accountable the men who had violated me as when I was a child. And so I thought at least I could tell him off. Everything that he's undergoing in that prison, you deserve it, kind of thing. But In our work with the group that he had founded called Prisoners Against Rape, I discovered that he had started changing himself before he'd even contacted me. So I wasn't his agent of change. I was his companion, helping him to evolve into something he wanted to be, which was a better human being. And somehow that kindled a response in me. Because when I was a child undergoing childhood sexual abuse, I had determined that what I went through would not define who I would become.
Yeah.
And I had to make that decision at 14. And so something in me resonated with him at 35, deciding that he was going to be more than what he'd been through and what he had done to others. So I defined that as my first calling in project because I was there to teach him about feminism and violence against women and Black history. He probably didn't intend this, but he taught me not to be afraid of my fears,
Wow.
not to be afraid of talking to my nightmares and engaging them in conversation and seeing how I could grow and learn from that conversations with things that I had shut behind a closed door and didn't want to look at. And so I started my book with that story to illustrate that even in the midst of fear, you can have the most improbable conversations with the most unlikely people and find space for you to grow. And so that's why it was significant to me.
Wow. Was this I love that you say you got the letter and you put it away. There was something in you that said, "Don't discard this. This is going to come back at some point," right? Um, and then, you use the words that he wanted to be a better human. I believe deep down in our soul that everybody has that little voice, that little piece of you can be a better person, but wanting to be a better person, the reaching out to be a better person takes a tremendous amount of courage. And as you said, calling out something that is traumatic, that makes you afraid, is the first step in the process of healing. And so he had made this first step. Was this first step for you a way to get comfortable with calling out things in your life? Is that how the practice became something as a practice?
Well, I think I was misinterpreting what the human rights movement does because I considered myself a human rights activist, even though I didn't even have that language back in the 70s.
Right.
But it is the job of human rights activists to hold people accountable who violate people's human rights. And that could be a corporation, a government, or an individual. But we misinterpret that when we see that as the tactic of first resort and not the tactic of last resort. In other words, we should try a number of other approaches before we call another person out or a corporation or a government because we'll make much more headway if we engage them in dialogue than if we engage them in a fight. And when you call out people or you cancel them, that's an invitation to a fight, not a conversation. And so if you want things to change, if you want people to change, you have to approach them in a way that creates the space for them to grow. Because if you close off that space for them to grow, then you get thwarted in your goal of reaching out to them in the first place. And they become convinced that you're not trustworthy, even though we want them to trust us, but you're not trustworthy if you fail to take their emotions, and their lived experiences into account. So, in order to call people in and get the accountability and change that you want, you have to call yourself in first and make sure that you're showing up in a way that's not leading with anger, blaming, and shaming, but leading with grace, love, and respect. The same thing you'd want to be offered yourself if someone is holding you accountable for your mistakes. It's so important to show how you do the work is as important as what you work on. Because if you want to grow the power to stop human rights violations, this means you need to call in a whole lot of people that you didn't think you need, you didn't think you'd want to have a conversation with, nor you didn't think you could tolerate the fact that every human being has a diverse lived experience. And what they've been through is not going to be what you've been through. And so many times we think we can only relate to people where we have this overlap of lived experiences or shared identities or shared ages or whatever. But the reality is that to build the power to stop human rights violations, we need everyone. And there are many paths to the mountaintop. You don't all have to be on the same path to eventually get to that mountaintop.
Yeah, and, I all I have to do is look around, and the message is really clear. There are no two alike. Every individual, their body, their life is unique to them. Their experience is so subjective. Their perceptions, their understanding, what's valuable and meaningful to them, what drives them, so very, very different. And yet it takes two to have the conversation. And, I know I've been in the experience of reaching out and saying, "Can we have a conversation about this?" Feeling the resistance or the anger. And when the answer is no, is there any way to push through, to ask again? Or is that the time when you have to step away?
All we can take responsibility for is how we use our grace and respect for the other person to make the offer.
Yeah.
It's only our ego that tells us that we can control whether they're capable of accepting that offer. And we actually think we can find the magical words to persuade somebody else to change, when actually, if those words existed, couples wouldn't fight, families wouldn't fight. If, if those words simply don't exist. But what does exist is your ability to lead with your integrity, to lead with your compassion, and then have that be the framework, the methodology with which you make that offer to engage in conversation. And so we've got to let go of the expectation that we're going to persuade somebody else to change. And generally speaking, people who are persuaded that they can convince somebody else to change usually aren't self-reflective enough to know that they are the first ones that have to change. And so it's interesting.
Absolutely.
It's interesting how that happens. And maybe because we're all socialized into thinking that we can dominate other people and force them to agree with us or think the way that we think is the right way to think. But that's simply, not only is it not achievable, in my opinion, it's not even desirable,
Yeah.
because I think there's strength in intellectual diversity the same way there's strength in racial diversity and gender diversity. And when we see that as a strength and not a liability, as you said, then we can take advantage and benefit from the multi-textural way life is. Life is beautiful when you appreciate its diversity and the fact that you can learn things from the most unlikely people. For example, I'm always awed by how much I can learn from people who only watch Fox News, which I rarely watch. But it does inform me what shapes their worldview, what misinformation they may be out there acting on, all those kinds of things. And so while I will never indulge in watching Fox News as my primary news source, I don't shut off the possibility that I can learn something from someone who does. And it's so interesting when you deal with these broad diversities of humanity. As a matter of fact, I probably get in trouble a lot, which is my favorite place to be, when I ask people, why are we so busy defending the acronym DEI when we could pivot to human rights and have this beautifully inclusive framework where every human being is included? And human rights covers all the diversity, equity, and inclusion that we want, but it even goes broader because it's not based on an individual identity, but on your humanity. And the best way to explain that would be to take the example of education. Every child has a human right to an education, but a blind child will need her books in Braille.
Yeah.
She doesn't have special human rights, she has special needs. And every human being is comprised of advantages and disadvantages. And the human rights movement require that we attend to those disadvantages so that everybody can enjoy the same thing that the people without those disadvantages enjoy. So those disadvantages could be because of race, age, m- uh, mental health, gender identity, sexism, or all of those other things. And so it's not ignoring injustice, but instead focusing on it in a more inclusive way than an exclusive way.
I love the word inclusive. And yet I find myself, whether it's watching the news or hearing somebody make a comment, of being socialized to, well, that's right and that's wrong. And then there's that pause. I take a pause and go, wait a minute, what can I learn from this? What can I learn from this opinion or this perception? And yet I still find myself, and maybe it is judging, I still find myself saying, I would not, like you said with Fox News, it wouldn't be my go to. I would say, I would not hang out with those people, or I would not be in that room. I prefer to be in this room. I somehow can't break away from that. And yet I understand the importance of being in a room and being open to hearing and feeling different opinions.
Well, part of the calling in practice is learning to enjoy sitting with discomfort and ambiguity, getting away from those certitudes of good, bad, right, wrong. Those binaries don't really work because nobody's all good or all bad.
Right.
Even people who have politics I extremely disagree with are generally kind to somebody, whether
Yeah.
it's their families or their pets. And so calling in requests requires us to focus on what's good about them and ask for more of that than only focusing on what's bad about them and joining the legions criticizing them for being, the wrong thinking, the wrong words and stuff. People don't need any help feeling bad about themselves. They manage that pretty well on their own. But we generally want to engage people in the human rights movement by making them feel joy for joining the human rights movement, affirmation, and a sense of belonging in joining the human rights movement. And you do that by focusing on what is good about them and helping that grow versus what is bad about them and instead helping that grow. Adrienne Marie Brown, who's an amazing writer, philosopher, poet, says, what you pay attention to grows.
Yeah.
And so you understand that I have a choice to pay attention to what's good about that problematic relative and using that as a bridge to have a conversation with them instead of starting off with what I critique about that problematic relative and hoping that they will change. I don't think the latter is an effective strategy. They just shut down, double down, call you names, and don't want to hear anything else you say. But if you focus on what's good about them and really show respectful appreciation for that, you'd be amazed at the rich and deeply textured conversations you can have with them. And you will find out so many things about them that you didn't even think you needed to know.
You're talking about really in today's world learning how to manage your emotions, the raw emotion of anger or fear or hate, which are emotions people will say they have and they feel, and they get triggered with an experience in life. But this process of calling out and calling in, to me, is a way to learn how to be honest with yourself. This is what I feel. But then move beyond that. Instead of that becoming a doorway, it becomes a way to achieve a new end, a conversation through um, with another that maybe you didn't feel that there was anything similar, and to experience more forgiveness and less cruelty, and to work together for a common good, in a sense, for both. Now, I know that I've been very afraid in today's world to speak sometimes. I'm afraid I'm going to say the wrong word, and then I'll get called out. I used the wrong word. Um, and yet, this book has helped me understand that I have to let go of those kinds of fears of making the mistake and just begin to have the conversation.
In the book, I talked about the four different types of intelligence that we need. Most people are familiar with the concept of emotional intelligence, the ability to know what emotions you're experiencing and to self regulate them. I also talk about cultural intelligence in the book, what we used to call cultural competence or cultural humility, the ability to recognize that the culture you've been socialized into is not the center of the world, that there are actually other ways of being and seeing and philosophizing about the world. But the two other types of intelligence are the ones that we discuss too infrequently. I think relational intelligence is very important so that we learn to right size our relationships to each other. In other words, stop having undue expectations of the wrong people, how to make sure that you're in a relationship that helps everybody grow rather than pull somebody down or humiliates them. I find in the call out culture, we don't right size the response. That if somebody uses the wrong word, we just assume that they are unredeemable. And if it's the wrong word to the wrong group, that you are actually an enemy, that kind of thing. And so, right sizing our relationships require relational intelligence. But the fourth one is the one that I most emphasize, and that's integrity intelligence. How you can default and should default to doing the right thing, even when nobody's there to witness it. The
Yeah.
same impulse that makes you want to hand back the excess change a cashier gave you, even though you could have gotten away with it. But the fact that you think so highly of yourself that you would not allow yourself to take advantage of another person, integrity, intelligence. And calling in is that opportunity we can practice every day to burnish up our own integrity,
Yeah.
to become more, to feel like we're self determining, and that we're making decisions that we can look in the eye without being ashamed of them. And so I really do love the growth opportunities that thinking about calling in instead of calling people out. Like when you're going to get your driver's license renewed and you encounter a mean DMV employee. Yeah, you can give them back what they gave you, but the choice not to do that, the choice to respond with kindness, with compassion, with empathy. I've never regretted offering that to anybody. I've only regretted when I called them out because generally that meant that I didn't take the time to see them as whole human beings. I only saw them in terms of their impact on me.
You know, the process that you went through, the integrity that you had when the rapist reached out to you and you felt all of this emotion and looked at the opportunity. I could really use my words in this moment to heal myself and really just slam this person from my experience, even though that wasn't the person that hurt me. But yet you chose not to. You know, what was that relationship wisdom? What was that? Where did that come from? Was that just your higher self talking to you? Was it a rational thought?
I like to think that I chose to go to that prison because of logic. At the Rape Crisis Center, we were providing services to victims that felt like putting a bandage on a gaping wound. Because as soon as they left our center, they could go out there and get re raped all over again. We had not stopped people getting violated. We had just helped them once the violation had happened. So my logic said, there's another part of this equation. How do we stop people from getting raped altogether?
Uh-huh.
So we're not coming in after the fact, but that it's a preventive measure. And so that's the little bit of logic that guided me to that prison. Revenge was a big part of it, though. So I'd be lying if I didn't say, I wanted to tell this guy off.
Yeah.
But I think I self soothed myself by telling me, yeah, but I also want to learn how to convince people not to rape. And so it was that mixture of things that I'm proud of and things I'm ashamed of that compelled me to go talk to that prisoner. But it was our interaction together. And by the way, prisoners against rape at the time were 6 men. It wasn't just one. And so it was our interactions that convinced me that in many ways we're all victimized violators. No one actually comes out the womb intending to hurt people.
Right.
It's what they've been through that persuades them that making others suffer is normal because they have suffered. And you don't have to hurt somebody to prove that you've been hurt. That is not necessary, but that's the default that many people are in because they don't know any other way to deal with their trauma.
Mhm.
And what changed it for me around those men in that prison was that nearly all of them had been incarcerated when they were teenagers
Wow.
in an adult male prison.
Wow.
So without any specifics, I figured out that they became victims before they became predators.
Yeah.
And they had formed prisoners against rape, not from some theoretical point of view, but because they wanted to stop prison rape, even though they were perpetrating it
Yeah.
as a survival mechanism. So it was very complicated to look at their reality and to humanize them as I learned more about their reality. And the thing that surprised me the most is the impact it had on my thinking and challenged the way that I dehumanized them, wanted to dispose of them, wanted to dismiss them, wanted to substitute them for the people who had violated me, and how it forced me to become trauma informed instead of trauma driven.
Is, trauma-informed trauma, versus well, where does forgiveness fit into this, I guess, is when I say that honest place where one can arrive and honestly feel forgiveness for the other who has harmed.
Well, all forgiveness starts with self forgiveness. The way that I teach it in my online course, and by the way, anybody can sign up for my course through my name, LorettaJRoss.com. I offer all
And
these
it's
lessons for
fantastic, you wanna do it, I'm telling
$5
you.
courses, $5 consciousness raising, the cost of a cup of coffee.
Right.
The way that I teach it in my course is to examine the experiences we go through as children. Because when you were a child, and if you made a mistake and you were severely punished or shamed for making that mistake, you're not going to learn self forgiveness, how to forgive yourself for making that mistake. So that means you're not going to be predisposed to forgive others that make mistakes. But if, on the other hand, when you made a mistake, if you were assured of being loved, despite making that mistake, if you were taught what you could learn from that mistake, then you're going to be inclined not only to learn self forgiveness for yourself, but be able to offer that grace and generosity to others. So, as adults, when it comes to forgiveness, we need to ask ourselves, do I want to continue those toxic patterns of my childhood? Or do I want to make different choices now that I'm an adult? Do I want to learn about self forgiveness, learn to counter this urge to be perfect that is not, as I said, achievable or desirable? Do
Right.
I want to own my mistakes and help other people own their mistakes? Not expecting that I will live in a harm free world, but also expecting that most harm that I experience is not intentional. It's just human beings being human together. This is what we do. We don't always know the impact of what we say or do is going to be on others. But we can take charge of choosing things to say things that don't have that negative impact. As I say in my book, you can say what you mean and you can mean what you say, but you don't have to say it mean. That's always a choice.
Yeah, and I think that, I totally agree 100%, and yet what I see today, through social media is a conscious choice to be mean. Willfully and knowingly, this is gonna hurt, I'm gonna do it, and I'm gonna make sure that I have a big audience to hear about my hurt and about who did what. Um, I think it's an unfortunate use of social media that does create harm.
Well, yes, social media is really just the engine, the latest tool to convey what has been historical human behavior. I mean, the original definition of a call out killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel. No,
Yeah,
it's not like the call outs are
uh,
new with the social media. I'm old enough to remember party lines on the telephone, where if you got a call, not only did the operator who connected the call could overhear you, but everybody else who was on that party line could
absolutely. I
overhear
remember
you.
sneaking I remember sneaking on. My grandmother would say, "Debbie, hang up that phone." I'd pick it up because I'd wanna listen. I thought it was, like, so fun, right?
Exactly. And so we have to be careful what we said about our neighbors on that party line, right? But people use that as opportunities to call each other out
Yeah.
and to publicly shame people. But one of the things that I want to make clear is that there is an appropriate use of call outs and there's an inappropriate use of call outs.
So
And
explain that
dividing the,
explain that a little bit. What's the appropriate and the inappropriate?
well, let's start with the appropriate.
Okay.
When someone who has power and they're choosing to use that power to abuse people, and they've been offered a chance to change and they've chosen not to. Well, that's when you're more likely to want to call them out because you want to stop the harm that they're capable of committing. You want to identify how that harm is occurring. You want to build community with those people who are being harmed and maybe even lift up how it's happening under the radar that people may not be aware of. Sometimes you just want to build community and express the outrage that people are feeling, or you want to use the power of shaming in those rare instances where it can work. So those are appropriate uses of call out. But my problem in the analysis that I offer is that it's not the right tool for every state, every situation of harm, though. You've got to right size the response to the harm. And so the inappropriate uses of call out is when your use of that technique or that tool is more about power and not justice.
Yeah.
In other words, you want to not only hold somebody accountable, but you want the public to see you holding people accountable. And
Right.
so that's why you stage it as a public call out on the internet or in person, because you want to virtue signal. You want to show people how woke you are, how you can bully and intimidate somebody else. You want to be seen as powerful. And so when you use calling out inappropriately that way, it's not about the pursuit of justice. It's about platforming yourself to feel power, to
Yeah.
feel like you're in charge, to feel like you can command somebody else to change. But it's also about our inner Karen. I'm going to get you fired. I'm going to tell your boss. I want you to lose everything that you've got, your reputation, etc.
Yeah.
That's what it's about, power instead of justice. But if you're really about achieving justice, you've got to, again, pay attention to how you're going about that pursuit because you cannot achieve justice by violating somebody else's human rights.
Yeah.
We're not fighting for equal opportunity to oppress somebody else. We're fighting for an end to oppression altogether. And that to me is radical justice, not just exchanging who gets to be on top and who has to be on bottom.
Right.
And so it's very important to only selectively and very cautiously use that powerful tool of public shaming because the person's life is never the same once they've been publicly shamed. There's a before and an after, like with any other extreme harm.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, those who delight in the call out don't understand that the only people who pay the biggest price are those who are already vulnerable. Because the rich and the powerful, they can ride the call out culture, the outrage culture, all the way to the White House. It's only the people who have relatively the same level of power as you do that's going to really lose their jobs or get kicked out of their church or stop being talked to, be shunned, and those kinds of things. And so, unless that's the outcome that you actually wanted, you need to question why you're using that particular tool for accountability when love and respect actually work better for accountability than blaming, shaming, and punishing.
Yeah, absolutely. I can say it was such a shock to me to experience this in my life and have my work criticized, and it was a real wake up call, just a real wake up call for me to realize how, even with the intent to do something so good, there can be that moment where someone feels afraid. And so the understanding the level of sensitivity that I need to take with my work was the real lesson. But the painful lesson for me was realizing that there were people consciously wanting to hurt me, consciously wanting to publicly shame me. I don't think I've cried so hard in my life, and And yet I would say that I'm stronger for it because of what you talked about, integrity. I was not gonna lash out. I was not gonna blame shame. I was going to just hold space for my feelings and the truth and realizing that this is this person's way of dealing with whatever they felt they were traumatized by, regardless of what truth is. That is someone's truth. But you said something that I think is so important, which I believe, which comes through in this book very clearly. We don't have the right to pass our pain onto others. Did I read that right?
Absolutely. As I often say, you don't have to hurt somebody to prove that you've been hurt.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you also talk about being angry with the right person and being angry to the right degree at the right time, the right purpose, the right way. I love that. There were lots of rights. And I found myself saying, oh my God, I think I'm doing it wrong. I'm doing it wrong. Um, and certainly in my relationship with my husband, I know that I have been angry at him and realized, okay, wait a minute. It's really not about him. I've just taken the opportunity to unload, right? So I love that, to really have that as a check. Who am I really angry with? What's the degree? Is the anger like a baseball, or is there a baseball field? How big is it? And when is the right time? Because listening and being able to hear each other is so very, very important. And why? Why am I doing this? What purpose? What meaning does it have in my life? And what's the right way?
Well, you ask a lot of questions in that dense question. So let
I
me
do.
try to peel it apart a little bit.
Okay.
The thing that I write about in the book, in partial answer, is how we calibrate our responses so that we come up with the right size accountability measure for for the harm that's been done. So that we don't impose the death penalty because somebody says homeless instead of unhoused. I mean, it just doesn't work that way.
Right?
And that's a very inappropriate use of your knowledge, your power, your bullying. It just shouldn't work that way. So calibrating the response. That's where also calculating intent versus impact matters. Because if someone steps on my toe accidentally, they're going to get a different response than if they did it on purpose, even though my toe is hurting under both circumstances. So I don't use the fact that my toe is hurting to lash out at them without considering intent versus impact. So that's also very important. But the thing that I think most matters is to stop outsourcing the remote control for our feelings to others. Take responsibility for what you're feeling, figure out a way to not then transpose or project those feelings onto other people. Don't deny your feelings. One of the things that I want people to do after reading my book is learning to have conversations with your feelings instead of denying them or pretending that they don't matter or leading with them. Because when you lead with your feelings, you're basically leading with your trauma for the most part, particularly the bad feeling. Now, if you lead with love, that's a different thing.
That's
But
a
if
good
you
one.
lead with your negative feelings, you're not stopping to take that pause, to gather yourself, to make sure you do a self assessment to see if you're all right, to see if you're hungry, angry, sleep deprived, irritated, or whatever before you choose to respond to somebody. And I like to think that we all can can and do self regulate all the time. We just don't recognize that's what we're doing. Because if you've ever parented a child, you know you cannot blurt out the first thing that occurs to you when
Nope.
your child says or does something stupid. Otherwise, that child will be in therapy for life. And though many of us have worked for bosses where we couldn't blurt out the first thing that occurs to us when they say something stupid. And so we self regulate situationally. I would like it to be done universally because it's already in us. We can do this. We can do it with the woman at the DMV or the driver that cuts us off that could precipitate road rage or the person who got my gender pronoun wrong. We can do this. And I don't accept the excuse that you can't because I know it's just human to bite your tongue sometimes when it'll get you in worse trouble. You can do it. This time, biting your tongue can actually lead you to more joy. It can be done. Now, when you talk about being called out, I like to teach in easily memorable ways. I have a 1, 2, 3 process when someone is being called out or publicly shamed. The first thing I say is thank them for doing it. And I know that sounds counterintuitive, but what I'm saying is that generally that person is gifting to you something that social media companies are paying millions of dollars for. And that's
Attention.
time and
Yeah.
attention.
Yeah.
And they're freely offering it to you.
Right.
They're telling you you're significant. They're telling you that what you did is worth paying attention to. And so that's the first step. Step number 2 is to give them the assurance that they've been heard, that you've taken them seriously. So you'll say something like, thank you for bringing that to my attention, and I'm going to consider what you've said. Notice what you have not done is agree with them, because that ain't necessary at the time.
Okay.
Because you just want to assure them that they've been heard, but you're going to take your own good time to figure out whether they're right. And then the third thing is to turn the calling out into a calling in. And you say that, thank you for bringing that to my attention. I'm going to consider what you said. But meanwhile, I'd like to know you to know that I care about you as much as I care about myself. So are you okay? Is there a reason you chose to call this to my attention this way rather than another way? And can we continue this conversation? 1, 2, 3. Then, once you figured out and thought about what you said, I offer in the book the chance to apologize right away and then the right way. So, in that moment, you can apologize right away because you're indicating, I'm willing to take responsibility if I have done something wrong. At the same time, the right way to apologize is after you've given yourself time to consider it, to
Mm.
review what happened, to actually make up your mind whether there's something you need to own, apologize for, and make a plan for doing better in the future.
Yeah, and that speaks to the integrity that you're talking about, to feeling that really when you do apologize, it's coming from that very truthful place where you have considered yourself and you've considered the other. It's such a beautiful, beautiful message in your book. Well, I cannot encourage you all enough to buy not one, but at least 2, maybe 3, to share this because you're gonna wanna keep it and refer to it. Um, Maybe it'll help you feel like you have a little more loving control over your life. Maybe it'll be a way for you to be a little more present and a little more proud of how you respond. Maybe less judgmental, a little more generous, a little more collaborative, which to me, that's what the human body is. My body is so generous. It is so collaborative. It's so appreciative that I'm here. But it's the listening, it's the paying attention to the nuances. It's engaging in a conversation with my body that allows me to sustain health and well-being. Well, it's the same thing in the world that we live in. Yes, we want to hold ourselves accountable and others, and we want to use love. We want to arrive to that place of forgiveness, which is so freeing. We want to have respect for ourselves and for the other, and most importantly, to give ourselves and others the permission to grow together. And sometimes that together means saying goodbye, and that's okay. That's okay because it's the wholeness and the growth that I think is so important. Um, Compassion. I've gotten so deeply into the sensation of compassion from reading this book and have been able to look up my own fears, my own moments where I have called out and I didn't call in. And I love this three-step process. So next time you feel that trigger and you want to blame and you shame, as Loretta tells us, say, thank you so much, right? Receive. And then give assurance to the person, I hear you. Thank you. I hear you. But most importantly, I love that statement. Care enough about yourself and say, I thank you. I care equally for you and for me. Can we have a conversation to go deeper, to invite the conversation? I love this. It seems simple and it's profound. It's profound for sure. I want to thank you so much, Loretta. Your journey has really been nothing but revolutionary, evolutionary. You have changed the world. So, what's next for you? I guess is what I want to ask. Are there any projects or anything that initiatives that are coming up you're excited about, you want to tell the listeners about?
Well, believe it or not, my next book comes out in September,
Oh,
along with Marlene Gerber Freed, who's the lead writer, and I'm the secondary writer.
okay.
We've written a book called Abortion and Reproductive Justice.
Wow.
It's going to embed the discussion and debate on abortion within the reproductive justice framework. And so that comes out published by the University of California Press in September, and it's available for pre-order already. So that's
Fantastic.
the next big project. Is it happens a couple of years, two of my books come out in the same year. It has nothing to do with planning. It just depends on when the book is finished and when the editing is finished. And so this is the second time I've had two books in one year come out.
That's great. Beautiful. Well, I'm very, very excited that and here's my last question. When you think about the word justice in today's world, what comes to mind?
Keeping everybody in the circle of concern, both the person who caused the harm, the person who's been harmed, and the healers who build containers for all of us. That we don't make people disposable just because they made a mistake.
Fantastic. How can people get in touch with you, Loretta?
My website is my name. So if they remember my name in any form, Loretta J. Ross or Loretta Ross, you'll always be able to reach me.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, again, I thank you so much. Um, get the book and pre order the next book. Tell me the name of the second book again.
Abortion and Reproductive Justice.
Excellent. I love it. I want to thank you all for listening to Get In. Remember, I think this is the most important time for us to get into conversations together, to lean into each other, to listen, to feel, to help us all heal. You can find out more about me by going to debbierosas.com. I write every single week, and you can sign up to receive at least 2 Body and Life articles every single week. Me on Demand, sign up for 2 free weeks of movement art for body, mind, and soul. And you can find me on Facebook and Instagram. Thank you so much for joining, and I'll see you next time.